The Sound of Waves, Chapter 10. Shinji's brother returned home to the island. The mothers were waiting on the jetty to welcome their sons. There was a drizzling rain and the open sea was invisible. The ferry boat was only about 100 yards from the jetty when its shape came into view through the mist. In the same breath, each mother called the name of her own son. Now they could plainly see the caps and handkerchiefs being waved from the deck. The boat had arrived, but even when they were ashore, face to face with their mothers, these middle school boys only smiled a little and went right on playing around among themselves. They all disliked showing affection for their mothers in each other's presence. Even after he was at his own home, Hiroshi was still too excited to settle down. About all he could tell of his trip were incidents such as the morning he'd been so sleepy because one of his friends had been afraid to go to the toilet by himself the night before and had pounded Hiroshi awake in the middle of the night to go with him. But not a word did Hiroshi have for all the famous historic spots they had visited. Certainly Hiroshi had brought back some deep impressions from his trip, but he didn't know how to put them into words. He would try to think of something to say, and all he could recall would be something like the time, already a year or so ago, when he had had such fun waxing a spot on the corridor floor at school and seeing one of the women teachers slip on it and fall. Those gleaming streetcars and automobiles that had come upon him so suddenly flashed by and disappeared. Those towering buildings and neon lights that had so amazed him, where were they now? Here at home, looking just the same as they had before he'd gone away, there were still the same old cupboard, wall clock, Buddhist altar, dining table, dressing table, and the same old mother. There were the cook stove and the dirty straw mats. These things could understand him even without words, and yet all of them, including even his mother, were at him to tell them about his travels. Hiroshi finally calmed down about the time Shinji came home from the day's fishing. After supper, he opened his travel diary and gave his mother and brother a perfunctory account of his trip. Satisfied, they ceased questioning him about the excursion. Everything was back to normal. His became again an existence in which everything was understood without the need for words. The cupboard, the wall clock, his mother, his brother, the old sooty cook stove, the seas roaring. Folded in these familiar arms, Hiroshi slept soundly. Hiroshi's summer vacation was nearing its end, so every day from the moment he got up until he went to bed, he was playing with all his might. The island abounded in places to play. Hiroshi and his friends had finally seen the Western movies that until that time they'd only heard about, and the new game of cowboys and Indians had now become a great favourite with them. The sight of smoke rising from a forest fire around Mitora on Shima Peninsula across the sea inevitably reminded them of signal fires rising from some Indian stronghold. The cormorants of Utajima were birds of passage, and by this time of year they were vanishing one by one. All over the island, the songs of nightingales were now frequently heard. The steep pass leading down to the middle school was known as Red Nose Pass because of its effect on the noses of passers-by in the winter, when it received every blast that blew. But now, no matter how cool the day, the breezes wouldn't even so much as turn a nose pink. Benton Promontory at the southern tip of the island provided the boys with their western locale. The western side of the promontory was entirely of limestone, and it led finally to the entrance of a cave, one of the most mysterious spots on Utajima. The entrance to the cave was small, only about 1.5 yards wide and 2 feet high, but the winding passageway leading into the interior gradually widened out into a 3-tiered cavern. Until that point, the passageway was truly black, but a strange half-light wavered within the cavern proper. This was because the cave actually went completely through the promontory to an invisible opening on the eastern side, where the sea entered, rising and falling at the bottom of a deep shaft in the rock. Candles in hand, the gang entered the cave. Calling "watch out" and "be careful" to each other, they went crawling through the dark passageway. They could see each other's faces floating on the darkness, tinted with grimness in the flickering candlelight, and they thought how wonderful they would look in this light if only they had the unshaven beards of young toughs. The gang was made up of Hiroshi, Sochan, and Katchan. They were on their way to search for Indian treasure deep in the farthest recesses of the cavern. Sochan was in the lead, and when they came out into the cavern where they could at last stand erect, his head was splendidly covered with thickly woven cobwebs. "Hey, look at you!" Hiroshi and Katchan chorused. "Your hair's all decorated. You can be the chieftain." They stood their 3 candles up beneath a Sanskrit inscription some unknown person had carved long ago on one of the moss-covered walls. The sea, ebbing and flowing in the shaft at the eastern end of the cave, roared fiercely as it dashed against the rocks. The sound of the surging waves was completely different from that to which they were accustomed outside. It was a seething sound that echoed off the limestone walls of the cavern, the reverberations overlapping each other until the entire cave was a roar and seemed to be pitching and swaying. Shudderingly, they recalled the legend that between the 16th and 18th days of the 6th moon, 7 pure white sharks were supposed to appear out of nowhere within that shaft to the sea. In this game, the boys changed their parts at will, shifting between the roles of enemies and friends with the greatest of ease. Sochan had been made an Indian chief because of the cobwebs in his hair, and the other 2 were frontier guards, implacable enemies of all Indians. But now, wanting to ask the chief why the waves echoed so frighteningly, they suddenly became his 2 loyal braves. Sochan understood the change immediately and seated himself with great dignity on a rock between the candles. "Oh, chief, what terrible sound is this that we hear?" "This, my children," said Sochan in solemn tones, "this is the god showing his anger." "And what can we do to appease the god's anger?" Hiroshi asked. "Well now, let me see. Yes, the only thing to do is to make him an offering and then pray." So they took the rice crackers and bean jam buns that they had either received or filched from their mothers, arranged them on a sheet of newspaper, and ceremonially placed them on a rock overlooking the shaft. Chief Sochan walked between the 2 braves, advancing with pomp to the altar, where, after prostrating himself on the limestone floor, he raised both arms high, chanted a curious, impromptu incantation, and then prayed, bending the upper half of his body back and forth. Behind the chieftain, Hiroshi and Katchan went through the same genuflections. The cold surface of the stone pressed through their trousers and touched their kneecaps, and all the while Hiroshi and the others felt themselves in very truth to be characters in a movie. Fortunately, the god's wrath seemed to have been placated, and the roar of the waves became a little quieter, so they sat in a circle and ate the offerings of rice crackers and bean jam buns from the altar. The food tasted 10 times more delicious than usual. Just then, a still more tremendous roar sounded, and a spray of water flung itself high out of the shaft. In the gloom, the sudden spray looked like a white phantom. The waters set the cavern to rumbling and swaying, and it seemed as though the sea were looking for a chance to snatch even these 3 Indians, seated in a circle within the stone room, and pull them to its depths. In spite of themselves, Hiroshi, Sochan and Katchan were afraid, and when a stray gust of wind blew out of nowhere, fluttering the flames of the candle beneath the Sanskrit inscription, and finally blowing one out altogether, their fear grew still stronger. But the 3 of them were always trying to outdo each other in displays of bravery. So, with the cheerful instinct of all boys, they quickly hid their fear under the guise of playing the game. Hiroshi and Katchan became 2 cowardly Indian braves, trembling with fear. Oh, I'm afraid. Oh, Chief, the god is terribly angry. What could have made him so angry? Tell us, O Chief." Sochan sat on a throne of stone, trembling and shaking majestically like the chieftain he was. Pressed for an answer, he recalled the gossip that had been secretly whispered about the island during the past few days, and without any evil purpose, decided to make use of it. He cleared his throat and spoke. "It's because of an immorality. It is because of an unrighteousness." "Immorality?" asked Hiroshi. "What do you mean?" "Don't you know, Hiroshi? I mean what your brother Shinji did to Miyata's daughter Hatsue. I mean Omeko, that's what. And that's what the god is angry about." Hearing his brother mentioned and feeling something disgraceful was being said about him, Hiroshi flared out at the chieftain in a rage. "What's that you say my brother did with Sister Hatsue? What do you mean by omeko? Don't you even know that? It means when a boy and a girl sleep together." Actually, Sochan himself knew little more about the word than this, but he knew how to smear his explanation thoroughly with insulting colours, and in a fit of rage Hiroshi went flying at Sochan. Before he realised it, Sochan felt his shoulders grabbed and his cheek slapped, but the scuffle ended disappointingly soon. When Sochan was knocked against the wall, the 2 remaining candles fell to the ground and went out. In the cavern there remained only the dim light, barely sufficient for them to see each other's faces vaguely. Hiroshi and Sochan were still facing each other, breathing hard, but they gradually realised what danger they were inviting by fighting in such a spot. Kachan intervened, saying, "Stop fighting! Can't you see it's dangerous here?" So they struck matches, found their candles, and went crawling out of the cave, saying practically nothing. By the time they had scrambled up the cliff, bathed in the bright light of outdoors, and reached the ridge of the promontory, they were again as good friends as ever, seeming to have forgotten all about their fight of a little while before. They walked the narrow path along the ridge of the promontory, singing, "Along the 5-league beach of Bentum Hachijo, and all along the garden beach." This 5-league beach was the most beautiful stretch of coastline on the island, lying along the western side of Benton Promontory. Halfway along the beach towered a huge rock called Hashijo Isle, as tall as a 2-storied house, and just now, among the rank growing vines on its summit, there were 4 or 5 playful urchins waving their hands and shouting something. The 3 boys waved back in reply and walked on along the path. Here and there in the soft grass among the pine trees there were patches of milk vetch blooming red. "Look, the sailing boats." Kachan pointed to the sea off the eastern shore of the promontory. On that shore the garden beach embraced a lovely little cove, and at its mouth there were now 3 sailing boats floating motionless, waiting for the tide. These were the boats that manipulated the dragnets as they were pulled along the ocean floor by larger vessels. Hiroshi said, "Look!" also, and, together with his friends, squinted out over the dazzling sea, but the words Sochan had spoken earlier still weighed on his spirit, seeming to become heavier and heavier as time passed. At supper time, Hiroshi returned home with an empty stomach. Shinji was not yet home, and his mother was alone, feeding brushwood into the cook stove. There was the sound of the crackling wood and the wind-like sound of the fire inside the stove, and it was only at times like this that delicious smells erased the stench of the toilet. "Mother," Hiroshi said, lying spread-eagled on the straw mat. "What? What's a meko?" "Somebody said that's what Shinji did to Hatsue. What did they mean?" Before Hiroshi realised it, his mother had left the stove and was sitting straight beside the spot where he lay. Her eyes were flashing strangely, flashing through some fallen strands of hair to give her a frightening look. "Hiroshi, where'd you hear that? Who said such a thing?" "Sochan." "Don't you ever say that again. You mustn't even say that to your brother. If you do, it'll be many a day before I give you anything to eat again. Do you hear what I say?" The mother took a very tolerant view of young people's amorous affairs, and even during the diving season, when everyone stood about the drying fire gossiping, she held her tongue. But when it came to its being her own son's affair that was the subject of malicious gossip, then there was a motherly duty that she would have to perform. That night, after Hiroshi was asleep, the mother leaned close to Shinji's ear and spoke in a low, firm voice. "Do you know people are spreading bad stories about you and Hatsue?" Shinji shook his head and blushed. His mother too was embarrassed, but she pressed the point with unwavering frankness. "Did you sleep with her?" Shinji shook his head. "Then you've not done a thing that people could talk about. Are you telling me the truth?" "Yeah, I've told you the truth." "All right. Then there's nothing for me to say. But do be careful. People are always minding other people's business." But the situation didn't take a turn for the better. The following evening, Shinji's mother went to a meeting of the Ape God Society. the women's one and only club, and the moment she appeared, everyone stopped talking, looking as though they had just had a wet blanket thrown over them. Obviously, they'd been gossiping. The next evening, when Shinji went to the Young Men's Association, flinging the door open as casually as always, he found a group of youths gathered around the desk, eagerly discussing something beneath the glare of the unshaded electric bulb. When they caught sight of Shinji, they fell silent for a moment. There was nothing but the sound of the sea floating in to fill the bleak room, seemingly empty of all human life. As usual, Shinji sat down against the wall, wrapped his arms round his knees, and said not a word. Thereupon, everyone began talking again in their usual noisy way about a different subject, and Yasuo, the president, who had come to the meeting strangely early today, greeted Shinji from across the desk in a hail fellow well met way. Shinji returned the greeting with an unsuspecting smile. A few days later, while they were eating their lunch on the Tahai Maru and resting from fishing, Ryuji spoke up as though unable to contain himself any longer. "Brother Shin, it really makes my blood boil, the way Yasuo is going around saying such bad things about you." "Is he?" Shinji smiled and kept a manly silence. The boat was gently rolling on the spring waves. Suddenly, Jukichi, usually so taciturn, broke into the conversation. I know, that Yasuo is jealous. The scamp's nothing but a big fool, sticking up his nose because of his father. He makes me sick. So now Shinji too has become a great ladies' man, and Yasuo's burned up with jealousy. Don't you pay any attention to what they say, Shinji. If there's any trouble, I'm on your side. Thus, the rumour which Chiyoko had originated and Yasuo had broadcast came to be whispered persistently at every crossroads in the village. And yet it still hadn't reached the ears of Hatsue's father. Then, one night, there occurred the incident that the village wouldn't tire of talking about for months to come. It took place at the public bathhouse. Even the richest houses in the village didn't have their own baths, and on this night Terukichi Miyata went to the public bath as usual. He brushed through the curtain at the entrance with a haughty toss of his head, ripped off his clothes as though plucking a fowl, and flung them toward a wicker basket. His singlet and sash missed the basket and scattered themselves across the floor. Clicking his tongue loudly, he picked the garments up with his toes and threw them in the basket. It was an awesome sight to those who were watching, but this was one of the few opportunities left for Hatsue's father to give public proof that, old though he was, his vigour was undiminished. Actually, his aged nudity was a marvel to behold. His gold and copper-coloured limbs showed no sign of slackness, and above his piercing eyes and stubborn forehead, his white hair bristled wildly like the mane of a lion. His chest was a ruddy red from many years of heavy drinking, providing an impressive contrast for his white hair. His bulging muscles had become hardened through long disuse, reinforcing the impression of a crag that had become all the more precipitous under the pounding of the waves. It might be better to say that Terukichi was the personification of all Utajima's toil and determination and ambition and strength. Full of the somewhat uncouth energy of a man who had raised his family from nothing to wealth in a single generation, he was also narrow-minded enough never to have accepted any public office in the village, a fact that made him all the more respected by the leading people of the village. The uncanny accuracy of his weather predictions, his matchless experience in matters of fishing and navigation, and the great pride he took in knowing all the history and traditions of the island were often offset by his uncompromising stubbornness, his ludicrous pretensions, and his pugnacity, which abated not a whit with the years. But in any case, he was an old man who, while still living, could act like a bronze statue erected to his own memory and without appearing ridiculous. He slid open the glass door leading from the dressing room into the bath. The bathroom was fairly crowded, and through the clouds of steam there appeared the vague outlines of people moving about. The ceiling resounded with the sounds of water, the light tapping noises of wooden basins, and laughing conversation. The room was filled with abundant hot water and a feeling of release after the day's labour. Terukichi never rinsed his body before entering the pool. Now, as always, he walked in long, dignified strides directly from the door to the pool and, without further ado, thrust his legs into the water. It made no difference to him how hot the water might be. Terukichi had no more interest in such things as the possible effect of heat upon his heart and the blood vessels in his brain than he had in, say, perfume or neckties. Even though their faces got splashed with water, when the bathers realized it was Terukichi, they nodded to him courteously. Terukichi immersed himself up to his arrogant chin. There were two young fishermen who were washing themselves beside the pool who hadn't noticed Terukichi's arrival. In loud voices, they went right on with their unrestrained gossip about Terukichi. Uncle Terumiyata really must be in his second childhood. He doesn't even know his girl's become a cracked pitcher. That Shinji Kubo, didn't he pull a fast one though? While everybody was thinking he was such a kid, there he went and stole her right from under Uncle Teru's nose. The people in the pool were fidgety and kept their eyes turned away from Terukichi. Terukichi was boiling red, but his face was outwardly composed as he got out of the pool. Taking a wooden basin in each hand, he went and filled them from the cold water tank. Then he walked over to the two youths, poured the icy water over their heads without warning, and kicked them in the back. The boys, their eyes half closed with soap, immediately started to strike back, but then they realized it was Terukichi they were up against and hesitated. The old man next caught them both by the scruff of the neck, and, even though their soapy skin was slippery under his fingers, dragged them to the edge of the pool. There he gave them a tremendous shove, burying their heads in the hot water. Still grasping their necks tightly in his big hands, the old man shook the two heads in the water and knocked them together, just as though he were rinsing out laundry. Then, to top it all, without even washing himself, Terukichi stalked from the room with his long strides, not giving so much as a glance at the backsides of the other bathers, who had now risen to their feet and were left staring after him in blank amazement.